Well, greetings and salutations to the 310 tribe. So good to have you here tonight on this Friday night. This is actually a pre-recording. We're doing this Thursday night, but I will be live in the chat interacting with you guys and kind of monitoring things from behind the scenes, as it were. I have tonight a very special guest, Timothy Gaines, or Tim Gaines, from the former band member of the band Striper for what, 20 years almost? It's
34 years.
But we
I'm old.
been friends. We've been friends now for a couple of years. It was so really cool to
Yeah.
connect with you, but you and your wife, and so
Yeah.
happy to have you in our community. And as I mentioned before, I mean, prophecy content on YouTube is about 1%, the total of it, So we are definitely a small tribe out there.
Yeah.
So how you been?
I'm good, brother. Just plugging away, It's been a cool year. It's been a lot of changes. So last time we talked, I was pastoring at a church, assistant pastor, and since then I've moved on, and I'm now with another church here in Phoenix. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm working with the worship, and we lead worship every Sunday morning, and so it's been cool. It's been a neat
That's
experience.
Pastor Bowen's church, right?
Yeah,
Does he
Pastor
go by
Dave.
Pastor
Yeah,
Dave? Yeah.
Standing Stones Community Church in Phoenix, Arizona. And
Yeah, he's been on my program once. I need to have him back on again. He was a very fascinating conversation, and I like his
yeah, he's
videos. He's
very
smart.
knowledgeable, about the Bible. I mean, it's like, you go to a lot of
As he
churches
should be.
today, and yeah, you go to a lot of churches today, you don't get that. But no, it's we're basically Bible end times, Bible prophecy oriented type of church, and I think most of our congregation, everybody follows the same YouTube channels, follows you, and Brandon Holthouse and Tom Hughes, Andy Wood. So everybody's kind of aware, and it's kind of weird because, at the church I was at prior, I taught Bible prophecy, and we went through, I taught through Revelation and through Daniel, and, there was a lot of people there that had questions, so every Sunday, every midweek, I would get bombarded by people with questions about the end times. And so it was really cool to be able to use the knowledge that God has given me, and what we read in the Bible, and to pass that on to people. And people are really getting excited about Bible prophecy in that church. So fast forward to this church, everybody knows everything already. So it's kind of like preaching to the choir. It's funny, but
That's a good problem to have.
yeah, it is, because you don't get that everywhere. And we searched for a few years trying to find a church in Phoenix that actually, was Bible prophecy oriented. So it was a blessing. It just kind of fell in our laps. We were watching. I forget who we were watching, Lamb and Lion. And Pastor Dave was on there, and he just happened to mention that he was a pastor of a church in Phoenix. So we ended up visiting one of their Bible studies, and we've been a member for about 1.5 years now. So it's been a total blessing.
It's good. Yeah, man. I think I don't know how I got connected to him. Maybe it was at a conference or something, but I I I heard I think I heard him speaking on Lamb and Lion or something with that, and then I knew he was in Arizona, so I texted you and I was like, "Hey, man, you got to check out this guy, this church."
Right.
And you're like, "Dude, that's my pastor."
That's where we go. Yeah, small
Where have you
world, huh?
been? Yeah. Well, hey, man, it's good to have you on. It's been the last time I had you on, I was in Kentucky too. That was
That's right.
3 years ago. It feels like.
Yeah, that was in the haunted hotel, I think.
Yeah.
No,
Well,
those days. Yeah, brother, thank you again. It's a pleasure. It's an honor to be on here with you and to be invited. And
Oh,
You know,
yeah, it's
we
been
love
too long.
you and love you guys, and uh, you know, we're always excited to be a part of, you know, this small community in one form or the other. So, thank you, brother.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. It's been too long. In fact, next time it's got to be at the most half the time from last time. So we have to try
Yeah,
to be, and it gets, life gets busy, and you just get caught up in, next thing you know, 6 months or 8 months goes by and you're like, wow, where did that go?
yeah,
But before we get started, I do have to mention a couple, just two admin things. One is the Guthrie Prophecy Conference in Guthrie, Oklahoma. I will not be speaking there, but you'll have guys like Mondo Gonzalez, Lee Brainerd, and I can't remember who else is going to be there. But it's a great church. It's a great time of fellowship, and it's not so big. Some of the conferences you go to, it's just so many people. This one will be very intimate, and you guys can definitely like connect with the speakers afterwards. So if you're in the North Texas or Oklahoma area, I definitely recommend going to that. The next thing is the storms. So I, I'm here in, what is this, Central Kentucky, and we're expecting to get, I don't know if this is ground zero for the storms, but it's good. The whole state's covered in like the most severe part of it. So I imagine this place is going to get hit pretty hard. But if you live in the Dixie Alley, if you live in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, the Western Tennessee, Western Kentucky, I would say most of Kentucky now. Um, Even Southern Ohio, I would say, just if you have uh, the means to stay in a secure place or whatever, or just do whatever you have to do to get prepared. I think this is going to trigger a bunch of different problems for this whole area. So, with that said, that'll be tonight through Saturday, I think, expecting to be the worst part of it. And then I'm not sure about Sunday, but Sunday's also going to have the remnants of those storms. So, okay. Well, tonight we're going to talk about something a little different than what I normally would talk about, just because I don't feel like I'm, you know, um, an expert by any stretch in any of the subject. But I was a big fan of the music through the decades, and tonight we're going to talk about the evolution and probably de-evolution of the Christian music industry in particular. And I found this, Tim, on there's an article that I was in the notes. It said "Make a Joyful Noise." I think that is the title of the article, and it was well written. The guy is like a Presbyterian pastor or whatever. But the part of it that I really wanted to read through tonight was um, the evolution of music in the last like 1,000 years, and I thought this was pretty cool how he did it. So you had, or I guess 2,000 years. He says the early Christian chant is the Christian's influence on Western culture can be traced back to the early church, who developed a chant as a form of worship. The most famous form of the chant is the Gregorian chant, which would be named after Pope Gregory the First, and set the foundation for later developments in Western music. And if you remember some of those songs, there's some songs from the 80s that had this Gregorian chants in the background, and it's
right.
very haunting, how it
Yeah,
sounds. Uh, then you have the development of musical notation. Christian monks were pioneers in the development of musical notation. I didn't know that. The medieval choral music during the medieval period, composers are now considered like obscure, like Hildegard of Bingen and Mouchet created intricate choral music for Christian worship services and ceremonies. But this laid the groundwork for the polyphonic music that would develop in later centuries. You have the Renaissance, I don't know how you say that, polyphony.
polyphony,
Um,
polyphony. Yeah,
yeah, whatever that is.
whatever.
uh, yeah, the Renaissance saw the rising of, you would have different types of instruments together, all playing in concert together. And most of the organizations back then, the institutions, universities, they were all Christian, so everything would have been geared toward Christian music. Then you have the Reformation time period with the hymnody. The Protestant Reformation brought about an enormous shift in Christian music. They were taking the writings and teachings of their influencers like Martin Luther, and would compose gospel-centered hymns. And so we think about hymns today. I think most of the hymns that we've really come to love and embrace were probably like mid 1800s to the mid
Mhm.
1900s. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, yeah,
Or like maybe with the exception of like Amazing Grace, I think the other hymns that have come along have been about the early 1900s and early mid 20th centuries.
yeah.
Um,
I've got some old hymnals here that I could look through, but most of them, yeah, I think they have a date of, mid 1800s or so on up.
yeah, so that is my favorite kind of worshiping, and like I've grew up on hymns. It's just what I don't know. I guess I'm just partial to that. I guess if I grew up in the 1400s, I would be partial to the whatever the monks singing and stuff in the background.
Right.
But,
Right.
you have the next period is the Baroque sacred music. On the heels of the Reformation, the Baroque era produced a wealth of sacred music, including Handel's oratorios, Messiah, Bach's Passions, and then Vivaldi's Magnificat. And these works are feature elaborate choral and instrumental arrangements. I think this would be between the Baroque and the classical would be the kind of the high points in terms of musical intelligence. Like I think a look at a guy like Bach or Beethoven and stuff that could write these symphonies
Right.
in every note and every how they're played, and so most of the time they're writing these things in their head
In their
before they put
heads, yeah.
pen to paper.
What was it? Is it Beethoven? One of them was deaf. He couldn't even hear.
Yeah,
I can't remember who. I think it was Beethoven,
I think
but
so.
yeah,
Yeah. And I want to say the story of Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach. It was either him or I think it was him, where his kids, if they wanted to wake him up in the morning, they would play a piece of his music, but they would leave off like the last note, and he would have to get up to go play it. Like he couldn't not let it go unplayed.
that's funny.
Uh, and then you and I, we grew up in this time period now where it's like with the choral music, where church choirs become part of the. So this is going to be in the last decades of the 20th century. It says contemporary Christian music, or CCM, became a significant genre within Christian music. Earlier artists such as Larry Norman, who is considered Christian rock, Amy Grant, Christian pop, helped birth the movement. And later artists such as Lauren Daigle, the Ambassador, the Gettys have combined creative composition and powerful gospel-centered messages. So that's kind of music from the earliest Gregorian times, whenever that was. I don't know when Pope Gregory the first was, but um, at least the Dark Ages up through modern times, and
Right.
we are now in this period where contemporary Christian music has been uh, kind of the predominant, and I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong in this, but the predominant form of Christian music of all the different genres. Would you say that's fair or no?
Yeah, you're correct. For the last 50 years or so, I would say.
Yeah.
Early 70s, I think, is when it started to really take off. Because I remember growing up, I was born in the 60s, and I grew up in the church. My dad was a pastor, so it's like we had big choirs, and I grew up with classical music and choral music, and so I remember that. And it was the early 70s, that Jesus Peoples, the hippie movement, whatever. And and I remember the music my sister listened to. There was, early Christian artists that came out of that 70s music, early 70s music, Calvary Chapel and all that stuff. So,
Yeah.
and it's just progressed ever since. But it's always seems like it stayed the same, that same genre, um, rock music or pop music. And
That's was
yeah,
that to me, because I was too little at the time. I was born in 74. But do you think that there was a messianic feel in the air? Like, people were, Hal Lindsey's book had just come out, The
yep,
Late Great Planet Earth in
yeah,
1970. You had the Calvary Chapel movement. You had, or the Jesus movement, which spawned the Calvary Chapel, kind of that movement of it.
Yeah.
Do you feel like there was a sense of like Christ is coming back like soon, like in the 70s, kind of, or maybe early
There
80s?
was, I remember the Hal Lindsey, I think he wrote that in 68 or 69. It came out in 70. I became a Christian in 72 as a result of the hippie kids. I went to a church camp in 72 and there was counselors that were hippies and, these long-haired kids, and they led me to the Lord. And so from then on, and then my sisters, I have a younger brother and two older sisters, and the music they listened to, like Larry Norman and Second Chapter of Acts, and later on it was later 70s, mid 70s was Keith Green, Second Chapter of Acts. That's what I remember growing up. Larry Norman and Randy Stonehill. So a lot of these Christian artists that came out of that hippie, the Jesus People's movement. And of course, Calvary Chapel was like a big deal. And Chuck Smith, and Lonnie Frisbee was, the one that actually got everybody, the young kids, to start going to church. And so it was a special time. And so I have memories of all that, and I grew up through all that, the late 60s and the 70s and into the 80s when I got into, doing my the Christian music, my version or our version of Christian music, which was, hard rock, heavy metal.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting to me that the 60s and 70s, I would say the Jesus movement was probably the closest, and this is going to sound controversial, the closest we've been to like really the Acts 2 church time
Mm-hmm.
in recent memory. I mean, in the last couple hundred years, it seems like people really were in love with Jesus, and they didn't care about the denomination, they didn't care what you look like, they didn't care about anything. They just,
Right.
and it seemed very innocent, I guess, and it's in how it all kind of played out. Like something good came out of it. I consider the Calvary Chapel movement something positive that came
Yeah.
out of that endured.
Well, think of all the pastors that we have today. A lot of them are dying. A lot of the guys are, they came through the early 70s Jesus movement, became Calvary Chapel pastors or other denominations, and the influence that they had. We just lost Hal Lindsey just passed not too long ago, and he was, if you look back on some of the stuff that he did in the late 60s, early 70s, where he's on campuses, school campuses, and he's kind of a hippie himself, if you think about it. And there was what was the guy's name who carried the cross? He Gosh, I can't think of
Yeah.
his name right now.
You're talking about.
Arthur Blessed. He came out of the Hollywood, and that whole hippie scene in Hollywood, and he carried a cross on his back, the full size cross, and carried it around the world. That was like his thing, and he so there was that influence, and it was a cool time, as far as I remember. The stuff I remember, but it was a really neat time, and of course, as you're growing up as a teenager, you rebel and all that stuff. So I had my time of all that too. But, when I came back to the Lord in 83, late 82, early 83, there was a whole nother scene, and Calvary Chapel was pretty much established. There was new Calvary Chapels all over, not only
Yeah.
Southern California, but all around the United States. And so that influence that Chuck Smith had early on, you could see it move out. It's kind of like, Paul going out into the world and establishing new churches, and it was that whole kind of thing. But yeah, with that, with Calvary Chapel, came the musicians, If you watch the Jesus Revolution movie, it's kind of based on Greg Laurie's life. That's how it was. A lot of these kids came in and they wrote, and this is where the beauty of it is, because they wrote music. And that music was being put back into the church. And a lot of them that were, when I grew up on hymns, for instance, some of that was put to music, again, some into modern music, but a lot of these kids were writing new songs, and they were using that music within the church. And I remember songs that were written that came out of Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, which is Chuck's church. They were using the same songs in some of the other churches. And then, of course, Vineyard sprang up out of that whole thing. And so Vineyard kind of had the same mindset, the same kids. They were more charismatic, I think. But, there was something offered to everybody back then, whether it was charismatic, through the Vineyard, or Calvary Chapel was more straightforward. But they use the same songs. And a lot of the people that are writing today, I think, came out of, that Calvary Chapel movement. And so we see a lot of that. It's pretty cool. And a lot of it was, and the other thing is, I think some of the music we see today isn't really theologically correct. But a lot of the music back then, as well as the older hymns, if you read the hymns, they're definitely theologically based, biblically based. A lot of the songs that came out of the Calvary Chapel movement, whether they're rock songs or whatever, they're simpler, but they're still theologically correct. Whereas we don't see that a lot today.
Yeah, well, let's go from the late 70s into the early 80s, about the time you're coming in. And I think, and I guess a lot of people don't think about this, but so if we go back to the 70s, we go back to the Jesus movement, things were simple. They were, theologically sound. The emphasis was in the right place on Jesus, on living out your faith, and not just talking about it amongst people that look and act like you. It's really going expressing that across cultural divides, and kind of what was needed, I guess, at the time that the country was at its most racially divided, and divided by drugs, divided by the war, divided by sexual revolution, et cetera, et cetera. Something out of this came this beautiful Jesus movement. And then out of that came something even, cooler, which is the Calvary Chapels that came out, that are still in effect today, whether through pastors that are still doing ministry work and stuff. And like you said, others have already graduated, Hal Lindsey and Chuck Smith not many years ago. And there's just guys that have
Some of
had
the
to
younger
slow
guys
down.
too. Yeah, some of the younger guys, they're all
So they
getting
have to
in
step
the
down
70s
for
and 80s.
medical reasons. But I think one of the things as we transition into the 80s was the introduction of music television, the video.
Right.
And I think if you look at the rise of the rock bands of the 70s, where Aerosmith and Led Zeppelin or whoever would go out on tour, and they'd be these big kind of things. It's like that now, but on steroids, with the video, because it's putting that much more exposure out there. And I think I'm going to kind of generalize this, but you can maybe talk through more of the detail, I guess, better than I can on this, is the commercialization of the entire music industry, of which the Christian music genre would be I guess at the time, a pretty small segment of that. Is that fair to say? Like a very tiny
Yeah, I
segment?
mean, when MTV came about, there really wasn't anybody doing Christian music. I mean, that was being put out there on TV. I mean, there was Christian radio. A lot of it was word of mouth, though. A lot of people were just, they buy albums because somebody came to their church. And there was CCM magazine was just, getting started, I think, in that period. And so, a lot of the kids, they'd hear about Christian artists through their church or through their youth group or whatever. Magazines like CCM that were just starting off. There wasn't a video channel for Christian music, and when did MTV come out in 83, 81, 82, somewhere? I can't remember when
Yeah, I
they
think it's
debuted.
81.
81, yeah. They weren't playing Christian music.
Yeah,
And,
yeah. But it changed the music industry, I think, in a way
yep,
that
yep,
hadn't really I guess we didn't realize the ramifications of adding music videos to what was already playing on FM radios or AM radio
yeah.
stations.
Well, I think
Now you're
in a way, it kind of dumbed people down because when you were listening to music before video came, you would kind of create an image of whatever you were listening to in your mind, as you listen to those songs. Then MTV comes along and kind of like presents you with a theme or whatever to a song that may not be what the writer intended, but some director and producer put a video together, and a lot of them
yeah,
were pretty cheesy back in the day. But
yeah.
so you're instead of like thinking for yourself, you're kind of presented with a thought of what this song's supposed to be about. And um, personally, I think it kind of helped dumb people down in society.
Well, you had I guess in the 70s you had like Rolling Stone and you had a couple of big uh, rock and metal magazines. But
Oh
if
yeah,
that's how you really got to see the artists other than like the album, unless
yeah.
you went and saw them in concert. That was kind of the three ways. Now there your favorite stars are accessible to you 24/7, or I guess back then it wasn't 24 hours a day. It was what was it 24 hours? I don't remember if it went all
I
night,
think they
but
were 20. I think when they went
were
on, they
they?
were 24 hours. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, but you're right. It does dumb the audience down because instead of imagining the whole thing in your head and you're having to use your brain to think through the song and the lyrics, et cetera, et cetera.
yeah,
Now you get this kind of canned presentation of what the video director thought the song represents, and it may or may not have one of the worst, and this is not a Christian song, but one of the worst, I think, one of the best songs that had the worst videos attached to it was Tears for Fears. Everybody Wants to Rule the World, and it just like it was the dumbest video on the planet, but like the song was good, and it just
yeah.
somehow there was a massive disconnect.
I know the song well, but I can't remember the video for some reason. But
Yeah, it was
yeah,
not very well done.
yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. So I think that you start to see the commercialization of the music industry on top of having a new 24/7 video channel. And now the new standard is not necessarily to get on the cover of Rolling Stones, which I'm sure would not have been a bad thing. But now the new standard is to have a number one video, and it's got to stay
Hmm.
on the air for so long. But that's all. It's just taking the commercialization that existed in the 70s and in the 60s and the 50s, and then really just adding gasoline on top of this already dry pile of whatever, and
Yeah,
it just exploded in the 80s. And that also helped with a new genre of music that was coming out, heavy metal, and later would be thrash and harder forms of that.
yeah.
But
Things progressed.
you came on the scene with Striper, and uh I can't remember the first time I ever heard you guys. Must have been in like 86. It was the first time, maybe it was 86 at the time, but
Yeah,
yeah, I was all into like heavy metal and punk music, and um this how do you think, I mean, from your perspective, I mean, you live this life, I mean, how was the Christian music, how was the Christian uh not just your bands per se, but how was it perceived across other genres? And did they see you as peers? Did they see, I mean, and not only that,
yeah,
but talk about the commercialization side of it, where you get a crazy record label, or a record label gives you this crazy deal, like, hey, here's, I don't even know how much those deals were, but let's just say hypothetically $20 million or something, or I don't know. But I mean, throwing all that money, don't you think throwing all that money at artists, especially like even Christian artists, would be susceptible to just
Yeah.
kind of being sucked into the world, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when we started off, well, the band was already in existence when I joined the band, but we changed the name from what it was to Striper. And so that was 1983. But we had all come out of the clubs of Hollywood. So the guys in the band and myself, we just played the same type of music that we had already been playing, and we went right back into those clubs that we came out of after we had all rededicated our lives. So we're playing the same places and the same audience. And our record company was a secular record label, and they had no idea that we were Christians until I remember the president of the record company came to the studio to listen to how the things were going. We were recording the Yellow and Black Attack, which was the first record, and he's listening, and he all of a sudden the lyrics, the one song was called "From Wrong to Right," and it says, "Jesus is the way." And he just kind of stops for a second and goes, "Wait, what did they say? Are you guys a Christian band?" He had no idea. And we said, "Yeah, we're a Christian band." So we at this point we had already had a huge following in LA, and they weren't going to make us change the lyrics, because whatever this formula was, which was the Holy Spirit, was working and drawing in kids. And so they just took it and had no idea how to market it or anything. They just did it as a regular rock band, which is really what we were. We were just regular musicians, but we happened to be Christians. And so we did that whole thing, did the Hollywood circuit, and then the first album came out and we toured a little bit. And then we did our first video for a song called "You Know What to Do." And I remember the guys from the TBN network, Trinity Broadcasting Network. Matt Crouch was, he was a young kid back then. And so him and another guy from a local Christian radio station in LA, they wanted to make videos. And so they did our first video. I think they did a couple of videos with us. And so the only airplay we got with that song was on TBN. And so that was like the first, and one of the local radio stations in LA, Christian radio station, was playing us too. And so from there, kind of the following kept building, and then we did our second album, which was Soldiers Under Command, and they brought us to Japan before the album had even come out, because just based on our looks, I had no idea we were a Christian band or anything either. So we went to Japan, and it was kind of like the Beatles coming to America. It was just like huge crowds of people, and it was kind of a culture shock for me, getting off the airplane, and you go through customs in Tokyo, and then all of a sudden you open these doors and there's like hundreds of kids screaming. I had no idea that they were there to see us. But we were just a local band in LA still. And from there things progressed, and MTV at that point was starting to play. They play one of our videos, Soldiers Under Command, sporadically, but it wasn't like, it wasn't in rotation or anything. And so we did that. Another year went by, and then To Hell with the Devil came out, and we did 3 videos off of that. The first 2 got in rotation on MTV, but it wasn't until the third video, which was a song called Honestly, when that came out, everything just broke. It was just, it was almost like that. We went from playing theaters and clubs to playing and selling out big arenas. So it was just kind of, you want to say overnight success, but it was really took a few years, 2 or 3 years before things finally took off. But even at that point, MTV didn't really know what to do with us because they didn't want to play us, but we still remember MTV had that dial in, you call in
Yeah.
for your favorite video. And so that's what kind of pushed us over the top, where the fans would call in every day, and request Striper, Striper this, Striper that. And then we were always like number one in their countdown because of the fans. So it's just kind of like, God was doing this cool thing because of the people, and they would call, requesting to see us or to watch us versus, whoever else was on at that time, the Bon Jovis and the Motley Crues and all that stuff. So we beat out a lot of those people, and it was, I don't know if it was because of our Christian lyrics or a combination of the music. And, there were Christians that didn't really have an outlet for, people that were your age at the time that didn't have an outlet to listen to hard rock music or heavy metal. And so when Striper came out, all of a sudden there's this Christian band that, they're allowed to listen to, because a lot of parents wouldn't let their kids listen to the music. And, so it's like, it kind of just built up over a few years. And I don't remember what our original question was when we started talking about it, but that's kind of how things took off. We didn't start off on a Christian label, and we weren't marketed in it is a market in that sense. We weren't marketed to the Christian audience. We were just put out there in the secular market. And it wasn't until later that we started doing deals with so here we go back to business, and it is a business. I got to say, it's an industry. Christian industry, it's a business, and most of it is owned by secular companies now. But during that time, you still had Christian bookstores.
Yeah.
And you had the chains, and so they would have separate marketing companies for Christian bookstores versus the secular stores. And so we had a whole separate company that marketed Striper to the Christian bookstores, and had a separate company that did the secular stuff. So man, there's just so much there's so much involved behind the scenes with all that too. So
Yeah.
I mean, we could get into the marketing and all that, but it's like,
well,
I think it gets
I honestly, you said it a couple of times, but like the studio executives very rarely were in touch with what's actually happening, to the point that they didn't even know that they brought on a Christian band, that was famous for, being a Christian
they
band.
just thought we were one of just another Hollywood, rock band with big hair and,
Yeah.
the clothes and everything.
And it was kind of a juxtaposition between you guys and, I know that a lot of the metal magazines back then would always pair, like kind of you versus Wasp or you versus Molly Crew,
Mm-hmm.
or, like it was always kind of like you guys were battling each other, like you were on one side of the town with guns loaded and ready to go to, war,
Right.
and the other side is the other guys, I don't know, I know they're selling magazines, but I
Yeah.
always thought that was
Well, you asked about our peers, and a lot of those guys were our peers, and
yeah,
they, some of the bands, a lot of them, everybody made fun of us behind our backs, but when they got to know us, and some of the bands toured with us, we all became good friends. And so it is what it is. But at the same time, there was a movement of we talked about the early Calvary Chapel movement and Jesus People and all that. There was another movement. I think the Holy Spirit was just moving through, in spite of ourselves, moving through the music and through that band, through Striper, and touching a lot of kids in those early 80s, early to mid 80s. A lot of people came to the Lord, like I said, in spite of ourselves, just being touched by the Holy Spirit, and hundreds and thousands of kids came to the Lord. And there's a lot of famous people that had come to the Lord, or were fans of the band back then. And I won't name any names, but I mean, there's a lot of people that are closet Christians that you wouldn't suspect, of being a Christian, but there's a lot of people that have come to us privately and told us that they're believers because, you know, the influence that Stryper had on them back in the day and caused them to think about Christ. Um, so yeah, that To Hell with the Devil, that album cover, uh, that was a controversial album
It's
cover
very
because
controversial.
the Christian bookstores wouldn't carry it because it had, uh, if you could see underneath the Stryper name or logo, there's a pentagram,
Yeah.
and that pentagram is being pulled off of. It's supposed to be Satan being cast into hell, and so the angels are pulling this pentagram off of Satan, and he's being cast into hell. So, but a lot of Christian bookstores wouldn't carry that because of that theme. And even places like Kmart, I don't think they
Yeah.
carried it either. So um, the album cover was pulled, and they just put out an all black album cover of the same album. And
Yeah.
so those early ones, you know, caused a lot of controversy, which, you know, Stryper ended up causing a lot of controversy anyways back in the day. And we seem to take a lot of heat from the church.
Yeah.
You know, guys like Jimmy Swaggart would blast us from, you know, his pulpit, and we had a lot of people, especially when we got into the Bible Belt, that would picket our shows, and it's kind of an interesting time. And so, you know, I grew up in California, and I grew up in the Presbyterian church. And, you know, when I started traveling with Stryper, things just, you know, I didn't realize there was a lot of different, uh, you know, the denominations. I didn't realize how different everybody was. And so, you know, we
Yeah.
get people coming to our shows, you know, we'd be doing these little autograph sessions before a show or whatever, and people would be yelling at us, you know, for wearing sunglasses, just weird stuff like that, or asking us if we were filled with the Holy Spirit, you know, with evidence of speaking in tongues, and, you know, stuff like that. So, um, yeah, I didn't know that was, you know, the evidence of being filled, but with the Holy Spirit. But you know, there's a lot of different things, you know, around the country and around the world, you know, that enter into the church that aren't really uh, biblical in that sense. But, you know, it was a learning period for me too.
Yeah, you were right though, because you know by the time I think when you guys came out, there really wasn't a good Christian metal option that people had. I guess you had Petra and you had some other
Petra,
bands that were kind of with harder rock in some regards, but nothing metal. And
right,
yeah, yeah, To Hell with the Devil was, man, that was a great album. It's still a great album. And then I love Soldiers Under Command too. Like I love both of those. I thought they were both great albums. And I just I
yeah,
had
they
never
were
been exposed to I'd only been exposed to like Ozzy and all the darker stuff that
right,
there was no I couldn't see there was nothing nobody to show that it could be positive. Like music is a tool, through all the ages that we talked about earlier, and even up until today and up until the time of the rapture. I mean, music's a tool. It can either be used for good or it can be used for bad. Same with
right.
computers or the internet or Google or artificial intelligence or weapons or anything. So um, it was cool to see you guys come out, and I can imagine that uh, as hard as it would be to just be a rock star, you got to add on to the fact that now you're a rock star, that you have to uphold this particular image, in terms of,
Mhm.
you're not out there doing drugs or, doing all kind of, throwing TVs through hotel windows and stuff, all the crazy stuff that the rock bands of the 70s and 80s did. Uh, so I don't know. I mean, and then you got the music, the executive studio heads and all of those guys are simply looking at it through dollars. They're not even caring about what
Right.
the message, whatever sells, right? I
If
mean,
they're
they're gonna,
selling albums, you know,
yeah,
more power to them. Yeah, it's
yeah.
all about the money.
And that to me. because when I think of Keith Green, I know that he, was a musician and he made his living that way. But I guess by the mid '80s, it had already begun to change pretty dramatically, because of one of these like outlier things like videos, now being
Yeah,
accessible 24/7,
yeah. Well,
and
you
the
think of Keith
advertisement and all
Green.
that stuff.
Think of Keith Green, and boy, his No Compromise album was probably the best testimony, or presenting the gospel and living a Christian life. I mean, it was just, theologically is a great album. And he passed early on. I think he died in '82 in a plane crash. But um, the short time that he was out there, and I think he did like 4 or 5 albums, all great albums. But he didn't go out there and sell records. He actually gave them away, and through
Yeah.
concerts and donations. He didn't want to ever sell his music, which was, I think, is a great thing. And I don't know how well they prospered, but I mean they did have enough to be able to buy a farm in Texas, I think, is where they were at, and to continue. Everything was put towards ministry. And, when he was in California, trying to make it as a musician, and when then he finally came to Christ, and his wife, uh, they they opened up homes to where people would come in, and they'd bring in people off the street, and they'd come and live with them. And so it was pretty cool, and it was strictly ministry oriented. Whereas, some of the guys who sign on with Christian labels, it becomes a business. And it is, like I said, it's an industry. Um, and in some cases, in a lot of cases, a lot of the Christian artists aren't really, walking the straight and narrow either. Um, and I've seen it as everybody, and I'm not pulling people, out and pointing a finger at anybody, because I need to look in the mirror, and
Yeah.
I look at the sin in my own life, and how God deals with me on a daily basis. And so, but I mean, for the purpose of the gospel, the Christian artist is put on a higher pedestal, maybe equal with a pastor, where they don't
Yeah.
even have that kind of training. They're not there uh, to preach a sermon. Some do, but I think a lot of them kind of get caught up in the whole hype of everything, and they get burned out pretty quick, being in that Christian industry, because they're pulled in different directions, and it's not what they think it's going to be. And a lot of artists, Christian artists lose uh, their drive. They turn to drugs or alcohol, or whatever. And so we see a lot of Christian artists that, you can't help but, when you're put on a pedestal like that to be worshipped, in a sense. A lot of these Christian artists are worshipped by uh, their audience. And God
Yeah.
didn't create us to be worshipped; He created us to worship Him. And so um, it's a tough thing.
It's certainly I mean, you could totally see it, how you go out and play a concert night after night and you got tens of thousands of screaming fans.
Yeah.
It begins to impact your psyche,
Mhm.
and I think one of the so talking about the issues that began to arise in the '80s, I think just bottom line would be the commercialization of it, and the marketing and the money, that all that stuff comes as trappings, of this world. But I think another thing that began to happen in the '80s, and I don't want to say across the board. I mean, I'm just saying this is more of a general trend. But the more that something becomes commercialized and marketed, the more that message has to resonate to a larger and larger audience. Therefore, you have to begin to water things down
Yeah.
to get to the most people without offending, or with offending the smallest amount of people.
Right.
And so I think from the 80s going into the 90s, let me show this. You get this dumbing down even more of the message. It's less gospel specific and more kind of positivity, you know, inspirational type of songs that
Yeah.
can maybe, depending on how you look at it, might be Christian.
Yeah.
It
Could be
certainly
taken
doesn't.
either way.
Yeah, it's like ambiguous, like are they talking about God or a woman?
Yeah.
Like who are they talking about
Right.
in the song? But it's just this kind of whole general move in that direction where now that the music industry heads who aren't Christian, the labels, let's say, a lot of these say, well, I think your song is too evangelistic. You need to dial that back. I mean, you're going to lose, 35% of this particular audience in this state or this country
Mm-hmm.
because of, this one word here. If you take it out, that's like another 10, $15 million you can add, to revenue. And I'm
Yeah.
sure that all gets driven into the albums and the songs and the song choices that are picked, et cetera, et cetera. Is that a fair assessment? Or
Yeah. I don't think the labels, in a sense, come out and tell you to water it down. But I think there's kind of a conscious, as songwriters, you want to get out to a broader audience. And
yeah,
so we saw people um, in the late 80s, early 90s, whenever say Amy Grant. I'm not picking on her, or Michael W. Smith, but I mean their label. Uh, there was a deal with A&M Records, I think, at some point where they were able to reach a broader audience through, and not just being stuck on a Christian label, which is going to just be sold. It's marketing again, so they're selling records or CDs in Christian bookstores. When they did this deal with A&M Records, they were marketed to the population, secular population, as well as a Christian population. So their albums were in regular bookstore, or not bookstore, music stores, and in the Walmarts and Kmarts, and they sold records, in a broader market than they would if they were just put on a Christian label and sold at that time in Christian bookstores. And
yeah,
so, and then also you saw their popularity too with MTV and VH1, and they just reached, so they had to cut back on their message. The Jesus is per minute. So some people, make sure they get a lot of Jesus name in there, uh, and then that's kind of a joke, as far as a running joke as far as Christian artists go. You got to get Jesus is per minute to make it a Christian song, but um, they cut back, and so the songwriting, they didn't just, I think Smitty writes most of his stuff, but I think Amy may have co-written a lot of with a lot of these secular songwriters. And
yeah,
so when these outside writers come in, and they're already established in the secular market, so when these outside writers come in and co-write or write a hit song for you, that song has a better chance of reaching this broader audience. And so, yeah, it's kind of a compromise in that sense, because you're cutting back on the actual gospel, in a sense, if you want to call it the gospel, or getting the good news out in your music. I don't know I don't know how well it goes over, because like Striper, in that sense, when we got more popular and we were out um, reaching more people, there was more people that were able to hear the gospel versus just the smaller non MTV crowd. So it's hard to say, if it does better reaching a broader audience, or does the compromise that you have to put there in order to reach that audience is, if you're watering things down. Ultimately, I think it's, when you're compromising, it's not a good thing no matter what. So,
Yeah.
we see that with a lot of, in my own life, I've seen compromise where it's taken me down, and I've seen it in other people's lives too. So, yeah, but all for the sake of selling more records, making somebody money, and that's the bottom line. If you think about it, this ultimately, Satan has his hand in the music scene, and it's not a good industry. It's basically it's is it prostitution? Would you consider it prostitution to sell
Yeah.
yourself or to sell your soul for money in that sense? I mean, that's kind of how musicians and actors have to be. They're selling themselves. They're selling a product, and you compromise on your morality in some instances to be able to sell that product. So
Yeah, no, I totally see that. And I mean, everybody faces little compromises throughout their life, but I don't think anybody has it as much and as intensely as people in the music and in the arts
yeah,
industries.
think about.
Because
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, because of how much of that industry, both in the music and the arts at large, are liberal in the, cultural sense, and so much is tolerated that even as a Christian artist, you're going to have homosexuals on your staff, or
Mhm.
makeup and hair department. Just there's just going to be people that you're going to be exposed to that's supporting your band, your music,
Sure.
your whatever.
Sure.
And now it's in a sense you're constantly being forced to compromise in a very obvious and public way.
Yeah.
And we can talk about that in a little bit, but like, I think you're right. It is a form of prostitution. And I would even say politicians are prostitutes, in that
Yeah.
sense. They're selling an image of themselves, or they're selling some version of
Yeah.
their plan for America, or their plan for this company or whatever. I mean, there's levels of prostitution in which we have to sell some image of ourselves to
Yeah.
some society. But rock
Well,
stars, music stars,
take what
artists,
you just said,
actors
image. You're like,
at
we're
the top.
speaking of the Babylonian system, in that sense.
Yeah.
And if you think about, how things, this is going to get off on another tangent, but think of how everything has progressed over the last 100 or so years. The first radio
Yeah.
station came out in 1922 or 24, and they started programming and playing music at some point to where electric music, the guitar was invented in electric guitar and bass in the 40s and 50s, to the rock bands. You think of how everything progresses, with television and just everything, that Satan has his hand on it all. And I believe that um, all of this is part of the Great Deception and the fall. Uh, the what am I trying to say? If you think about how people are exposed to music and how it causes you to not really think about things, but you're still having like sin thoughts put in your mind through a song, and or you watch stuff on TV or on the big screen or whatever. I think it's all part of a plot by Satan to deceive people, to pull them away from uh, the Lord. To If you think about in Revelation 18, the fall of the Babylonian system, where it even mentions, music won't be heard, or
Yeah.
whatever. It's something along those lines. I got to pull it up to get the right quote, but it says something along the lines of music will not be heard within your walls anymore, or something like that. It's like, the point is that God references music. Even at the fall, the Babylonian fall, there's music mentioned, and so you think, well, there's got to be some pull to music, and the influence of music on people and people's minds, that even something like that might be mentioned. That's just my thought, but
yeah, no, that the music, the sound of music no longer being played as part of that judgment
yeah, there we go.
during Revelation 18. But like, certainly, I mean, we look at Isaiah. I think it's Isaiah 14 where Satan is described. It's either there or Ezekiel 28, but one of those two descriptions of Satan or Lucifer then was that his body was an instrument,
Right.
apparently as some type of a cherubim. He had some
Pipes and
ability to supernaturally produce music in ways that we are not, unless
right.
his voice was what was considered the instrument itself, but certainly has used it to great effect. And you got to think about, what does music do? Music, depending on the cadence, the rhythm, the beats, the mood of it, it puts us in a state of mind. I mean, and I
Yeah.
don't know, I'm not an expert on the mind or the brain, but it does something. It puts you in a particular state of mind. So if I listen to happy, energetic music, I'm going to be energetic and kind of hyped and
Yeah.
whatever. If I listen to sad kind of alternative, whatever, and the keys they're playing, the notes they're
Yeah.
playing to reach those kind of they're very emotional and emotive in how
It,
they change your perception, and you get in a very somber mood or sad
Umber
mood when you
causes depression. People that are depressed,
yeah.
actually, I don't want to say they go out and look for it, but they add to their depression by listening to that kind of music, or anger for that
Yeah.
matter. Some of these guys, put on some thrash metal and, they get very angry. How about when
Yeah.
you're driving, you're driving in a car and you're listening to some loud, hard music, and it causes you to kind of have road rage. So it has an effect on people, all the different
Yeah.
styles of music. So I wish, it's something I probably should study more, as far as the effects of music on, our minds and our spirits.
Yeah. Well, so we got, not only did you have the music industry changing, so you start off in the 70s where it's kind of organic and it's genuine. You go into the 80s and you still have that organic and genuine. It's just got a harder edge to it now. And you've got crazy exposure through MTV, VH1, and just the whole genre that's shifting into to the big screen or whatever, and away from just pure radio in newsprint. And then you get into the 90s where you've gone through classic rock, you've gone through heavy metal, you've gone through this kind of weird pop, whatever phase. And now there's Nirvana coming out, and Nirvana changes the tone in music, and I can't even say it, secular music. And then that also, I think, so each era that comes, the Christian music mirrors the culture in a way.
Yeah.
So if you think about the 50s, right, you've got the guys up there in their three-piece suits and they're playing their instruments. They're very formal. They look like they're, church elders or deacons or whatever. And then the next generation, it's kind of the hippies. So they're all the Christian players, but they've got longer hair, and you can just tell they're hippies, or you could pick out the decade they're from, how they're dressed and their hairstyles and whatnot. Same thing with the 70s, jeans, bell bottoms, longer hair,
Right. Yeah.
mustaches, all of that. The 80s, then the 80s has its own kind of multi-period time inside of that, from the early kind of new wave, early 80s, Pretty in Pink kind of phase, to heavy metal, rock, and then the late 80s going into the early 90s, with Guns N' Roses to then Nirvana, this huge shifting in culture. But then you could see it reflected in the Christian bands and their album
Yeah.
covers, et cetera, as well. And then you see, because you're right. So, like, most of the Christian artists didn't have Christian labels to go to early on, so they just were blended in with whatever that
Yeah.
particular Atlantic record or whoever was
I mean, there
what their
weren't
big
there weren't
group
Christian
was.
labels. I think one of the earliest ones was, Maranatha Music, which was a offshoot of Calvary Chapel. To
Yeah,
market, there we use that word again, marketing. But I mean, that
yeah,
was that was how they reached people, and they sold records at the concerts and stuff. So I mean, Chuck Smith put money into this label to uh, allow these bands to, Love Song, for instance, or some of the others to uh, make some records so they could have something to either give away or to sell to help them with finances, because these guys weren't making any money. They drive to a church somewhere and play, 2 hours away, and not even have enough money to put in their gas tank, to get them back home. So I think Chuck had a vision to help these guys at least, sell a few records, at a
yeah,
church, after they got done playing, so they could, get in a hotel room or something, because there wasn't a lot of money involved, there, and still to this day, there's I think you mentioned something like $20,000 or $20 million budgets, which was, I think, the largest budget we ever had. Striper back in the day was around 300,000, and that also included to put into videos, and not only the recording studio, which is like $1,500 an hour to record. You figure over several months of recording, how it
yeah,
adds up, and ultimately that ends up coming out of your own pocket, because you got to pay that. It's a loan in that sense. You have to pay that back. So the the least amount of money that we could spend recording something, but at least come off with something that was quality. We we try to get away with not spending what we had to. But uh, first album, I think we did for like $5,000, which wasn't a big budget back then. And it just, the budgets went up, in videos, and the better albums that were created because of the quality equipment and whatnot. Does that justify the end, to spend
yeah.
all that money? I don't know, but I know that there isn't a lot of money to be made, um, especially these days, and there wasn't back in the day either. But somebody was getting money. It just wasn't the bands, and they're the ones that are taken advantage of.
It's the agents, the
Yeah,
agents.
agents and the record companies. Somebody's and the lawyers. Everybody's filling their
Lawyers,
pockets, but
yeah,
the
lawyers are
art.
going to get their money.
Mm-hmm.
So we are now. Well, one of the things that we didn't talk about is the transitioning of, you mentioned Vineyard early on, but you get kind of, I guess, in the late 90s, the kind of the transformation of certain churches to much more entertainment driven worship, praise and worship times.
Mm-hmm.
So Vineyard and Delirious, I think, were two examples that I had seen. Um, but you could see this kind of bleeding through this idea of the seeker sensitive church movement, where you're trying to make the church more than just a place to go worship. Now it's a place to do all of your holidays, the big and churches. I'm not saying they were doing this exactly in the 90s like that, but it was starting to move in that direction. And
Yeah.
then the rise of mega churches, which mega churches had started, I think, probably in the late 80s. And certainly, you could go throughout the 20th century where Billy Graham would have a revival and there'd be,
Yeah.
20,000 people there or whatever, but or 100,000 people. But I'm just talking about the normal Sunday church that you go to. A lot of churches begin to explode.
Right.
Uh, and the downside of all of the public exposure that Christian music got from the 80s to the 90s because of videos, because of the increase in commercialization. Now artists are having to compromise on a lot of things to work with other particular artists. I think Amy Grant had some, I remember the first time Amy Grant did a crossover with somebody that was in a secular music. I think it was Peter Cetera
Oh,
from
Peter Cetera.
Chicago.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember that was controversial back then. Like,
Right.
it was seen as kind of a big deal that she did that. And but that she certainly wasn't the last. I mean, from there on, it was
Yeah.
just kind of like the floodgates. And now it's nobody thinks anything about it for a Christian artist. And I mean, you had Rick Rubin producing Johnny Cash's remake of a lot of the songs. And one of the songs that Johnny Cash remade was "Hurt" by Nine Inch Nails. And
Right.
I
Yeah.
mean, Nine Inch Nails is about as antichrist as a band as you're going to get.
Yeah.
But the song, was something that the lead singer Trent Reznor had wrote about his time in his struggles and drug addiction, and then Johnny Cash
Mhm.
turned that into uh, something. The video of it is haunting.
It
it's
is.
beautifully done. It is, and the message in it, I think, is Johnny turned it to more of a Christian message of what's the word, vanity, that all is vanity kind of thing,
Right. It is.
without God
Yeah.
in it. But yeah, so you have a lot of this crossover starting to happen, and but then moving into the 2000s, you post 9/11, we get the rise of these kind of branded churches, Hillsong,
Whole song and
Bethel,
Cousins. Yep.
yeah, I guess Vineyard has continued. Then I want to say International House of Pancakes, but it's a International House of Prayer, IHOP in Kansas City. But yeah, I don't know. There was a shifting again, and it feels like it's even more compromised now.
Yeah. I
But I don't
think
know.
a lot of that, which the music had a big thing with drawing in people to put butts in the seats, and with that would be light shows and smoke on stage, and it's turning it into a rock concert basically. Um,
Yeah,
and I don't want to say that we had anything to do with that, but I mean, I think with so many Christian kids coming and going to see bands like Striper back in the day, and they were, and seeing the big show and everything, I think it may have sparked some people's interest to maybe bring that into the church. I know there were a few churches that we did play early on where they presented us as a rock show, and then to their youth, and then we saw later on the churches starting to incorporate all the same theatrics, and the music. Um, the rock music kind of started with Calvary Chapel in that sense, but it was worship, and it was praise music, and it turned into something where it became a rock concert at some point, but I don't know when that began. But you mentioned Hillsong and Bethel. It also turned into a big enterprise in the sense of publishing. So I don't know if most people, if they go to a church nowadays and you're singing your morning songs, up on the screen, there's going to be a little code at the bottom, a CCL or CLL or whatever. It's a number. Every song that's published is being marketed in the sense that the publishing goes back to either the artist who wrote the song, or in some cases like Bethel and maybe Hillsong also, it goes right back into that organization. So they get money every Sunday, and every church that plays a worship song that was written by somebody else, they have to pay in. So all that money gets funneled back. It's just like an artist getting played on the radio where they get their 1 or 2 cents per play.
yeah,
It's the same thing with the churches where they take all that money that the artist or the church, and in the sense that Bethel now owns the publishing to a lot of those songs, or Hillsong, it goes back and funneled back into that organization. So there
yeah,
you see a lot of a lot of the churches nowadays are playing whatever without any idea that the money goes back to Bethel or Hillsong. And so a lot of us have stopped playing those songs on Sunday mornings. And we'll come up with either something that is written by church members or something that is not funneled back to them, because obviously their theology is messed up. So it goes back to money being filtered back into their church. And so you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars being funneled back into those organizations through the publishing.
Yeah. Yeah, I've noticed Bethel on a lot of hymns. And I had a question. I don't know that you know the answer to this, but like, you a lot of the great hymns that are now over 100 years old, like who gets the royalties or whatever
Yeah,
from?
they're public domain, and I think it's
Yeah.
I don't forget the time frame. I think it's 75 years. Anything that's published that's over 75 years
Yeah.
um, goes into public domain. So at that point, nobody gets the money for it except the person that's, like if I was to take an old hymn and make a recording of it, I get all the money for that through the album sales. And I'm not sure who gets any publishing for that. But whereas if I take a newer song, say you wrote a song and I played it, you would get the publishing for that, and I would get the mechanicals from, which is actually the actual disc that's sold if you're buying CDs, or the downloads, the digital downloads. But still, there's a company. There's several companies that collect those royalties, and they keep tabs on everything, and everything's done digitally now. Anyways, that means they keep track of all the downloads, of all the recordings, every time something's played on the radio, and you name it, it's being kept track of, and somebody's getting a percentage of all those plays or those sales. But the it does the same thing with like books, and so the older books, from the 1800s, that are republished again through different publishing companies, they get 100% of those sales. Whereas the writer back in, like your books, for instance, in 75 years from now, I think
Somebody
those,
could.
yeah, it goes to public domain, if we're still alive and here, of course, which we're not.
Man, if we're still here as a human race in terms of things still going on as they are,
Yeah,
then oh man, I wouldn't even want to think about that.
yeah, yeah,
Well, one of the things too that has changed the whole music genre or the industry to include Christian music has been the rise in social media. I mean, back in the 80s, if I wanted to learn about my favorite band, I had to go buy a magazine that had the story about, whatever band,
right.
Striper, and then that's how I knew what you guys were like, based on what was edited and done in that. And so all of those are carefully put together narratives. But now on social media, you can see your favorite stars, and you're like, wow, those guys are really like super progressive or super liberal or super this or
Yeah,
super that, because of how they're
yeah,
virtue signaling stuff. And that's not worked out so well for the some of the newer artists. Like Lauren Daigle, who had a really famous song back in 2018, and I think within a few years ago, she was put in a situation where she's kind of asked point blank, does she support homosexual marriage?
right.
And she gave this real squish answer that really kind of set off a lot of Christians. Were like, okay, you're either completely compromised, or you just don't have any kind of opinion because you don't have that theological depth that you're singing about.
Yeah,
And but so that's huge. I mean, even you guys back in the 80s and early 90s, well, I would say probably up to the mid 90s, you guys didn't have to really worry about social media. I mean, you had the news, the
no,
paparazzi, that kind of stuff, but you didn't
yeah.
have that direct
I
touch to
we would talk about, back in the day, it would be, simple interviews with somebody asking us questions on about our music, or how do we mix God in with playing rock music, and there was it was simple back then. Whereas today
yeah,
you can't even, like you said, you get online on social media, and it's out there like in seconds, and you definitely have people that are against you, and you're aware of it right away. It doesn't take like a month or two to start receiving letters
no,
or phone calls. It's like it's instant.
pretty much instantaneous.
Yeah, yeah,
But yeah, so that's a new challenge that a lot of stars have not, or some have adapted, and a lot have not adapted that well, to be that exposed. But I think, as specifically talking about Christian music, and I think the transition from Christian music being something completely but not entirely separated from the church, to then having these own branded churches, or franchise churches that make the music production next level,
hmm,
and something that draws in these massive crowds. And the music itself is not theologically deep at all. It's a lot of repetitive, repeat this phrase over and over. That kind of goes back to the very beginning, right? The early Christian chants, the Gregorian chants
yeah,
of just chanting the
yeah,
same thing over and over and over. And
yeah.
they draw on that. That's a big part of the emergent church movement, is trying to tie back into the early mystical, kind of desert fathers perspective of worship.
There,
And
yeah,
that all
eh,
gets, if you want,
yoga and all that
it's
stuff.
got pagan roots, and it's also got tie-in.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think.
it's kind of the ultimate blending of Christianity with paganism.
Yeah, Billy Crone did a whole series on that, and just the chanting. I think it was yoga, but I it's been so long since I've seen it. It's been a year or two. Um, but he goes into that, and it kind of makes you think about even where we are with music in general, let alone Christian music, and and what they're trying to get people involved with, at the concerts, or the church services. I call it a concert, but it's like it does get them worked up into a trance, in a sense, playing that stuff over and over again, and certain droned sounds, or notes. Um, I think it might. I don't know, because I haven't studied, but it may definitely open up that door uh, to mind control, in a sense.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah,
not.
pineal gland, right? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. I can see how going to a Bethel or Elevation, or whatever, one of these services where the lights are dim and the music's going loud, and you got some lights going here and a fog machine there,
Hmm.
and you're there, your guard's down, right? So when you go to church, you let your guard down, especially if it's the church you always go to, because you kind of think you know what to expect, and now you're going there for this feeling that you get from the worship.
Yeah.
And it's almost the exact same lie that we see with the Mormons. When you talk to a Mormon, a devout Mormon, they'll talk about how do you know that the Book of Mormon's true, and they'll talk about this burning in their bosom, right?
Right.
This feeling they get that just kind of overwhelms them. I'm telling you, you can replicate that feeling, being overwhelmed spiritually, in a kind of we talked about this last night, the synthetic spiritualism of an experience because of music, because of notes that are played, and it affects your soul in a certain way,
Hmm.
in
Yeah.
whatever, if that's through the pineal gland, or if it's some other part of the brain that's allowing you to go into this kind of rhythmic trance. And and then you listen to whatever the message is from Mike Bickle or whoever, and it's theologically vapid. I mean,
Yeah.
so but then you're associating that message with this really amazing feeling. So it doesn't really matter what that teacher says, because you're going to associate positive experience, or vibes from that experience, because it was such a, you don't remember necessarily what people tell you. You remember how people make you feel, and
Right. Yeah.
those are the people you really remember. And when you go to a concert like that, and it's completely designed from start to finish to get you to some particular emotional state, then whoever is coming on and giving the message, they could tell you that that you're worshiping King Kong, and you could just go on all kind of ridiculous things, and
Yeah.
it just whatever, you're still in this emotional state. So you tend to accept things like that a lot more, which is why cults, use a lot of they use this stuff because they know it works. This type of mind control.
Yeah.
But,
The
but
Jim
yeah,
Jones effect.
yeah. Well, I don't know, man. I've looked at Christian music, and I was telling you earlier that one of the albums that I was really impactful to me. Let's see if I can get back to this image. Uh, because of how it made me feel, in terms of I don't know. It's hard to put into perspective. I always looked at that was heaven, and the guys that are in the woods right there, they don't want to go, and they're going
Oh
to end
yeah.
up in
Yeah.
some bad place. And although it's a very simple picture, it always resonated with me. And I think this album and probably To Hell with the Devil were the two, in terms of visual impact to me, that of almost any album cover, for that matter.
Yeah.
Uh, Certainly, there's some rock albums that are memorable in their own right and stuff, but those two had impacts to me in the sense of in a spiritual sense, and it's such a powerful weapon that is both used for good, it can be used for good, and God created worship. Obviously, the angels in heaven worship at the moment of creation. They are integral when you go to all the scenes from heaven, that there's always the sound of worship and praise going on.
Yeah.
Paul was like, I can't even describe it. Like, he doesn't, I don't even know if I can put it into words, and they're in 2 Corinthians 12, and John is seeing this worship of the angels, the elders, the church there. And he's just, again, blown away by this. Uh, so we know that this is a powerful and integral part of the human experience, music is.
Right.
And I think that is that one of those things that Satan has been able to effectively weaponize against humanity. And so if I could summarize Christian music in a sense, that it went from something that sprang up organically, and I'm talking about contemporary Christian music, not going all the way back to the Baroque period or
Right.
whatever, but like,
Say the
you
last
have,
50 years, 40 or 50
yeah,
years. Yeah.
you certainly had a desire to worship God, and that becomes manifest when you play in front of a church or a group or whoever, and then they're like, wow, you're really good at this, and so then you go to another church, and then you go to another, and so what turns out to be good, that you're actually out there spreading the message. That concept of that, then as time progresses, that whole process gets commercialized, and this is where Satan takes over, and he's like, I'm gonna derail this whole thing because I don't want this thing
Yeah.
to get any bigger than it is. And I think for the most part, Christian music has remained a subgenre of, music at large, right? It's just one of the subcomponents of it,
Sure.
like classical or Spanish or,
Yeah.
uh, Irish dance music or something, like it's a subgenre. And even that, though, has been, Satan has been able to kind of dilute the message down to where it's now it's highly marketable, but is it really impactful to the person listening to it?
Yeah.
And we're spiritual beings. We're three parts. We're body, soul, and spirit. And the soul part of us is that mental part, right? That makes the individual you, because that's based off of your frontal cortex, and that's shaped by your education, your experiences, and your experiences are then shaped by how things make you feel in the
Sure.
moment, whatever that feeling is, whether it's fear or happiness or sadness or whatever. And that feeling is greatly exacerbated, uh, to more than almost anything, by music.
Yeah.
And if you can remember the way this song made you feel because you just won the football game and you get in your car or your truck and you crank this song and it's the first song that came on, and it's you associate that, and it's a very, very powerful um,
Think,
connection that we have to our spiritual natures. And I think that's why so much goes through the pineal gland with people wanting to open that up with drugs or through yoga or
yeah.
through whatever.
Think of
Or,
adolescence too. I mean, most of us listen to music in that junior high to high school age where it actually meant something. I can't listen to music today and have it has the same effect on me as it did when I was a kid. I can listen to, or I can probably quote you lyrics perfectly from songs that I listened to as a kid, whereas today, because I knew them so well and it had that meaning to me,
yeah.
whatever that might have been, versus songs today where I'm, in my 60s now, I'm not really, I don't care so much. I'm not developing anymore. I'm kind of declining.
Well, I think it's an I we it's how we identify ourselves. And when
Yeah.
I was a kid, I say kid, when I was in high school, you were either a stoner, you were a cowboy, or you were a jock, or you were a
Yeah.
prep. We had all these little categories we put ourselves in. And if you were a stoner or a headbanger, you only could listen to this one thing. You could never listen to country. You could, and
Right.
so
Yeah.
we put ourselves in these categories so that those songs we identify, uh it's something, it speaks to how we identify ourselves at that point in our lives. But today, I would even say, going back to, for me, when I was 33, but when you begin to identify with Christ, all these other things kind of pale in comparison. And you're right, it just doesn't have that same impact anymore,
Yeah.
no matter how powerful it was in our, when we were younger, listening to it.
Yeah. I still, and so I mentioned earlier Keith Green, his No Compromise album, and then also second chapter of Acts. If I go back to like my infancy as a Christian and remembering Christian music, other than hymns, of course, but I would say those two artists, Keith Green and second chapter of Acts, probably had the most influence on me. And it wasn't even so much that I chose to listen to them as much as that's what my sisters listened to. And
Yeah.
I remember going to a Keith Green and second chapter of Acts concert in California, and I remember feeling the presence of the Holy Spirit, and tugging on my heart, and so I those songs and those groups always hold a special place for me. And like I said, I can't tell you anything that I've heard today um, that has really influenced me as much as those early songs, those earlier groups, from the 70s and early 80s. Petra, too, might be another one. Petra and Sweet Comfort Band. So there wasn't too many.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too that when you look at, and I don't know, we're looking at this now in hindsight, but I look at you versus looking at some other rock stars that kept that lifestyle going, and they have not aged very well. They look like, uh
Catches up with
I
you.
don't know. I don't want to name names, but there's some ones I'm just like, oh man, you let yourself go. But I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't know. I don't know how all the rest of the Christian artists out there made it, but you guys have certainly been in a unique position in your lives to be at the right time, the right place. You're at the right wave when this thing is cresting, and at the right time, God gets His message out at that
Yeah.
almost the pinnacle of the heavy metal movement, and
Yeah.
rode that all the way through.
And I think
And
that's
then
the ultimate, God orchestrated it, regardless
yeah,
of ourselves, because we're a bunch of knuckleheads. But um, God had a purpose for that, and there's a lot of people that were reached, and
yeah,
for the
no,
kingdom.
for sure, yeah, yeah. You'll be decked out like a Mexican general. I'm gonna be the little guy in the soft shoes and then pushing the broom in the corner. Janitor. No,
Never, never.
you guys, I'm telling you, man, you guys had a massive impact on, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, millions of impressionable teens at the time. And you won't even know until you get to heaven. You'll have all
Yeah,
these
I have
people
no
come up and
idea.
say, "Hey, man, yeah." And music again is such a powerful tool that when people, we talked about the negative of it, but the positive of it is that if there is a good song out there that has a good message and it's pointing people to Christ, uh, and it hits the right person at the right time on the radio or however they hear it, and it has the power to change things for the better too, to maybe change
Hmm.
their outlook and get them on a different path. So music is it's a sword. It cuts both ways. It's both good and bad, depending on who's using it or who's wielding it.
Yeah,
And I am somewhat sad for the Christian music industry as a whole, just because it's like kind of everything else in the world. It gets corrupted by this Babylonian world system that we live in.
right.
And I'm not knocking all of Christian music. I think this is across the board, from churches to uh, even prophecy ministries to, I mean, everything. I mean, everything right now on planet Earth is fair game for Satan to
It
try
is.
and to destroy and corrupt. So, um, I love that. I love that idea, though, that when times become very messianic, you start to see, we get a little glimpse of how powerful, when the Holy Spirit begins to move in a place, how that reshapes Southern California in the late 60s, early 70s, or
Yeah,
how it impacts these massive revivals that happen from here and there, and we just get a small glimpse of that. And that feeling you had. Think of the biggest concert you all ever played at, and that rush you get kind of just going out on stage or finishing the last song or whatever, whenever it is. Multiply that by like a trillion, and that is a small glimpse of what will feel like in heaven, in the
yeah.
presence of God, the creator of the universe,
Amen.
with all of these angelic beings, things that we're just looking at like, I had no idea angels look like that or
Yeah,
whatever.
we won't know until we get there.
Yeah, and Christ comes out, if you're thinking about Revelation chapter 5, and he looks as both the one as a lamb slain from the foundation of the world, but also he's
Mm,
also the Lion of the tribe of Judah, like victorious eternally and with all power and glory, like just in ways, like I feel like Paul right now in 2 Corinthians 12, like you just don't have words for it.
yeah,
Just seeing him come and appear in this midst of tens of millions of Christians, dude, that's going to be electric. I mean, I would venture to say there's going to be electricity running through that crowd of believers, of just how much energy and love and just devotion and worship is going to be generated in that one moment.
amen.
Uh, and that's just the beginning. I mean, that's just the beginning of, we can't even fathom how amazing it's going to be going into the future.
Yeah,
And
brother.
that's the beauty of music, is that it lets us tap into that spiritual nature. And Satan has been very effective in hijacking that for the last, who knows how long.
Yeah.
But
Well,
it's
he's wanting to keep everyone away from the Lord, in
for
whatever
sure.
way he can, whether it's through music or drugs or whatever. So he's got an agenda to keep people away from the Lord. But praise God that he uses people also to bring them to his presence, and God's got a plan with music also. God created music,
Yeah.
you know. Satan may have hijacked it, but God's ultimately going to use music for his glory and for his praise and for his worship. And that's ultimately what we need to be doing through music is to worship the Lord.
Yeah. And I would just kind of add this last thing. I'm trying to think of the exact passage. Um, it's where King David is coming back from a victory, and I'm trying to see if I have the passage here. Uh, his David's wife, Michal,
Oh,
Michal, uh, was watching him come back in, and he was in front of the army, which had the musicians all playing, and he was out there just dancing like nobody was watching.
right.
And she despised him in her heart. I remember reading that in the passage. And I know that I think when worship is really the most honest uh, and natural is when you don't care what anybody else says around you, and you're going to raise your hands in the air or what,
Yeah.
people. I grew up Baptist. We're not used to doing that. It's very uncomfortable for me to do that.
Yeah.
But
Presbyterian.
I see people worshiping. I wish I could do that. I wish I had that. But I know that when people are in the spirit in that moment, man, it is a very powerful thing, and it's just a small glimpse of what's coming. So,
Amen.
well, I have a good report uh, for you in terms of just the blessing this has been on my whole, I don't know, the last 3 years or so. I think it's awesome that I get to hang out and talk Bible stuff with you. That this is a
Yeah, man.
something that
Well,
it's
likewise,
very cool.
it's because when I was away from the Lord for, I was backslidden for the longest time, and when 2020 happened, as a lot of us had that awakening or reawakening, and so I just my wife and I we just started diving into. We couldn't find anyone teach to teach us to learn through, and so we started going through the YouTube and Bible prophecy. I think we started off with JD Frog, and from there everything blossomed out. And I
Yeah.
can't remember how I stumbled upon you, or we started watching your videos, your podcast, and then we were just digging everything that you're saying and some of the other guys. And then I saw that you made a comment one day on Facebook, or you put a like or something, and I saw Pete Garcia. I wonder if that's the same Pete Garcia. And so I clicked on your picture, and sure enough, it was you. You had been following me, and you probably had no idea that I had been following you for a year or two.
No
So
idea.
yeah, no, so it's cool. And so it's a small world, and you know I'm blessed by what you do and your teaching, and what my wife and I are, and you know I think we feel like we're family to each other, possibly. It's been cool getting to know you and to text with you and talk to you back and forth over the last few years. So
Yeah.
I'm just as blessed.
Well, I got to think that because I listened to Striper and I had a few other Christian bands I did listen to back in the day, back when I was searching and just being a normal teenager in the '80s or whatever. Uh, that was something that I could go back to. That I was grounded in it. There was
Mm,
something I could cement in that time to where um, it's a touch point for my faith. Like I can remember
yeah.
being being there at that concert in Waco. I think it was '87. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what year it was, '86 or '87. And I could think, okay, well, I was there, and so there is that touch point. I remember being, like wanting to be a better Christian than I was a Christian at the time, and then like you, I drifted for a number of years, came back, and I'm thinking back, and I have the luxury now of having that nostalgia of being there at a Striper concert or listening to the Altar Boys or some of these other groups
Oh yeah,
that had a good message, Petra,
yeah,
and it's good. It's a good feeling to have that to be able to have some good nostalgia in my life and not just like I was just a complete reprobate, you know.
yeah.
And I don't know. It's been cool. It's been a very cool experience and how this has all turned out. So
Yeah.
um,
Amen.
one day, I don't know, maybe if I can ever get out to Arizona, I would love to go to y'all's church and hang out and uh,
That would be awesome.
with yeah.
We're having in June. Is it June? Yeah, June. We're having a big prophecy conference,
Oh,
and I can't remember the date off the top of my head, but Lee's going to be there, Tom Hughes, Brandon, and a few others. And so, man, it would be great to have you come out too.
yeah. I mean, I don't know where I'll be in August, but you say August, right, or June?
June, June.
June.
I can't remember the
Um,
date,
yeah.
but
Arizona in June, though. That's got to be like
it's going to be warm.
blisteringly hot.
It's not. It doesn't really get that hot until um, July, August, September. It gets hot. Let me
Okay,
see here.
it's a
Uh,
dry heat, though, right?
it's a dry heat. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
going to be June 6th here in Phoenix.
June 6th. I will write that. I'll put that on there. Is it
Yeah,
on the website already?
yeah. Hang on, let me pull it up here again. Um, June 6th. It's yeah. It should be on the church website, or I can send you forward you a link here at Standing
Yeah.
Stones Community Church. And so Brandon, JB Hickson, Tom Hughes, uh, Pat Wood's going to be there speaking.
Well,
And
then
there's
your pastor too.
and our pastor. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
there's going to be a few others. Um,
gonna be awesome, man.
yeah. Well, I just got out of here. Now, how do I get back? There we go.
Well, how can people follow you or keep up with you these days?
Mainly I've kind of taken down all my uh, websites, but Facebook is probably the easiest way to get in touch with me or to follow me. And it's I'm gonna have to pull that up too. Just search for Timothy Gaines, and I have two Facebook pages. I have one that's kind of like my official, fan page or whatever you want to call it, and then I have another one that's a personal page. But let's see if I can pull it up here really quick. Facebook. I should know all this off the top of my head, and I don't.
I don't know mine either. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a lot to keep up with.
What is my just Facebook Timothy Gaines? I can't find it. That's crazy.
I'll find it. I'll put it on there.
All right. Yeah. Thanks. I think you're
Yeah,
following me. So
yeah. No, and I don't know. This is all still pretty cool to me. I am a little jealous of Pablo. Pablo got to go out to y'all's hang out with y'all. What was that, a couple years ago?
oh yeah, I went out to California, and we met
Yeah.
up at Jack Hibbs Church.
Okay,
And
that's what it is.
so yeah, and so we'd been same kind of deal. We'd been kind of texting and back and forth, and so we just happened to be out. Actually, as my father had passed away, and so we were at the funeral, and then we decided just to go to check out Jack Hibbs Church that following day, and so we went there and hit up Pablo and just kind of met. It was cool. So, and then
Yeah,
I've been on
very cool.
his podcast a few times now too, and it's been cool. God's uh, really been doing some cool things, and just getting to meet people like you, and getting grounded in the Word, and being called into being a pastor. Is like I never in a million years would have thought that I would that I would do that. And that was a great learning experience, and it was a blessing to be able to teach, because all of a sudden I was like, all these years of studying the Word, and I did attend Bible college for a short time, and so it's like I got to put into practice um, a lot of the stuff that I've been learning since the '80s, and so it was great, and I still continue on with teaching now, which has been a blessing even at our church, the new church I'm at now. We have
Mhm.
home studies and groups like that where I'm able to lead the studies, and so it's a blessing. I like it. I like it.
I,
Yeah.
I love teaching. I don't know. It's not. I don't like to preach. I don't really think I'm a good preacher. I'm more of a teacher kind of person. But
Yeah,
like
yeah,
I love
me
to get
too.
up there and teach.
I preached
It's probably
twice at
been
our
my
church, and boy, it was. I'm very introverted, so it's like it's a terrible thing. I wish I would have been made an
yeah
extrovert instead, but it's like it's painful to get up in front of people sometimes, and even being a band, and I could play in front of 30,000 people with my guitar on, but if they take that spotlight and point it towards me, I'll mess up. That's
yeah
just I don't like the spotlight. So at any rate, I preached a couple of times at our church, and boy, I'd rather be in a smaller group and teach that way. It's nerve wracking.
yeah.
Some guys are very
It
gifted, though.
I don't. You know what? For me, I don't even. I think I lost that whole fear of public speaking when I was a commander, and you had to get up in front of all your soldiers and talk about
Oh
whatever.
yeah.
But the first time I spoke at Prophecy Watchers, it was in 2021, I think it was, in Colorado, and I was teaching through Jude there, or doing a presentation on the book of Jude, and I was fine. And then as I got closer, I got just insanely nervous.
Hmm.
I can't even put it. I'd never been that nervous before.
Yeah.
And thank goodness that Tom Hughes and his wife were there, kind of cheerleading me on, in the back.
Yeah.
But it just something, it came over me every bit as much as like uh, when I was at Korea and we were hiking through these mountains. And I had just gotten near the edge, and it was just like a straight drop for like 2,000 feet.
Oh wow.
And something came over me like that. What do they call it when you got a fear of heights?
Fear of heights.
Whatever it is.
That'll
But
work.
it just swept over me like vertigo or something, and
Yeah.
it felt like that. And then, but that was the last time it ever happened to me. After that, I just, I got up in front of 800 people here, or
Yeah.
there and another place and a few places. And the fear of that kind of just went away. I think that was kind of Satan trying to, dissuade me from going
Yeah.
in
For
that
sure.
direction.
For sure.
But I love that. I love to teach. I think that is one of the my favorite things to do. Um, and I wish I could play a musical instrument. I kind of tinker around on a guitar, but I am not very musically inclined, which hopefully in heaven, I
Yeah.
will
The Lord will
be given
give us
some
those gifts.
supernatural gift to play something.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome.
maybe it's the maybe it's the bongos I'll end up playing,
The
but
bongos.
he'll give me
I think we'll all be
some.
playing some kind of stringed instrument, or singing for that matter, before the Lord, which will be
I
awesome.
don't, I don't know if I'll be singing. I'm not a very good singer, but
Well, we're
man, it's
going to
been
be in our
great having you on
glorified
here.
bodies, right? So,
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. That's true. Well, Tim, it's been great having you on, and thanks for
thank you,
talking.
Brian.
And it's just it's crazy, this whole subject. Hardly anybody talks about it nowadays. Mostly, it's just done in a hyper, critique of everything wrong with Christian music.
Yeah.
There's been some good through it, because it certainly impacted people. It impacted me, and I know I'm not alone. But yeah, like with everything else, it just gets kind of
Yeah.
corrupted by the world that we live in, and that's kind of the nature of everything, um, from ministries to music industries to everything, politics.
Yep.
war,
Yep.
technology. Everything is impacted by this fallen world. So,
Yeah.
but all right. Well, hey, good chatting with you, and
Thank you,
definitely have
brother.
to do it a lot sooner than we did last time. So we have
Yeah.
to make this a
Thanks for
concerted
having me
effort.
on. Thanks
Yeah,
for having me
I've
on.
looked.
I appreciate it. And I look forward to doing another one.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. All right, brother.
all right. God bless, man.
God bless.